Before we begin, I want to warn listeners about the subject matter of today's episode. We'll be talking about graphic torture and cause of death relating to asphyxiation and stabbing. Also, I'm going to be calling into question the authenticity of a holy relic and elements of the crucifixion. So if you're going to get upset about that, leave now. Also, my roommate is in the room, so if you hear him, or if you hear rustling, it's just him in the background. I'm recording this on a Monday afternoon, so I can't really do anything about that. And I mean, I don't really mind him being here. It's just, you might hear some little sounds. So, here we go. Hi, and welcome to the 4th episode of Spooky Betches. I'm Kirsten, and today we're going to be talking about something that is, for a change, up my alley in terms of academic study, which I'm really excited about. We've done personal stories, aliens and cryptids, and unsolved crime, so I think it's time we turn to something a little more mystical and seemingly unexplained. Today we are going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin, which is a Catholic relic of the Crucifixion. What does that mean? I'll explain that later, but first I want to tell you why I'm so pumped to talk about this piece of cloth. If you followed this podcast since the beginning, you'll know I'm working on a degree in art history, in which one of my areas of focus is late medieval to early Renaissance art, specifically religious subject matter in the period of 1350 to 1570 in Europe, give or take a few decades. That probably sounds really boring to someone who isn't into art history or history, and honestly, it's a pretty broad topic for a historian, but this is what interests me, and who else is going to do it? I grew up in an Episcopalian family with a heavy influence from my Catholic grandmother and mom, which I'm actually very appreciative of since it's what started my love of this stuff, and the reason that this is one of my topics of study. So that's enough about me. Let's turn to the topic of today's mystery. If you don't know the story of Jesus, that's not really important for today's episode, and probably won't be coming up in any further episodes either, but you do need to know about his death, and though it might seem hefty, this is the shortest I could make it. Alright, so Jesus was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, which led to his arrest by Roman soldiers. He was taken to trial in front of Pontius Pilate, who, depending on the version you're reading, sentences Jesus to death either based on his own decision, led astray by his wife, or leaves it up to the crowd and they demand his execution. Jesus is then tied up and whipped brutally for entertainment. This is a Roman colony at this point, so this was it was similar to watching football today. Yeah, they did really brutal things to entertain themselves. They apparently put him in a purple robe, which I find very difficult to believe as a historian, since purple cloth costs a fortune, and that's not an exaggeration. It was only for the emperor, and I mean, you're not going to give a criminal a purple robe. It would cost probably thousands and thousands of dollars in today's money. Yeah, it was probably the cost of a small house. And then a crown of thorns was placed on his head to mock him for being called the King of the Jews. So he was forced, some say, to carry his cross to Golgotha, the scene of the crime, if you want to call it that, and he was crucified. Today, when we envision the cross, we see it as an uncapitalized T shape, which Jesus' hands and feet were nailed to. Crucifixion was a really common manner in which Romans carried out executions, and they're actually really creative with their manner of execution. Look up St. Lawrence. He was grilled to death. That was exciting. But there are really few accounts of how they were placed on the cross. We know that there were a few different cross shapes, but it's very unlikely that the one used for Christ was this shape that we think of today. There are two that are the best bets for Jesus' death. It was probably either a capitalized T or X shape, which today is called a St. Andrew's cross. For both shapes, the arms and legs would be tied to the extremities of the wooden frame. In the T-shape case, they would loop the arms around the back of the top of the beam for support, and would be fairly close to the ground for ease of removing the body. Whenever they depict Jesus in crucifixion images, he's 10 feet off the ground, and that wasn't something that they would have done because they had ladders, but it would be really inconvenient to get a body down from that, which actually we're going to talk about bodies later and what they did with them. But Romans also tended to reuse crosses for convenience. They sometimes use nails on the hands and for ankles. Imagine a rotisserie chicken. However, a nail on its own would just rip through the hand under the weight of a body, and where's the fun in that? They're not going to last long on there. They're going to literally just plummet, which is just a horrible image, but it's the truth. So, in all, they would have used ropes to tie the people on. There's no use in using just a nail. According to the Gospels, which get more and more wild as they progress, Jesus spent 6 hours on the cross from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. 6 hours is practically a walk in the park when the goal was to have the victims live for as long as possible, sometimes 3 to 4 days. The cause of death in crucifixion is asphyxiation. Basically, the lungs collapse under the weight of the body due to gravity, and sometimes the Romans would even feed the victims so they didn't die of starvation or dehydration. So Jesus dies, and to make sure, a Roman soldier named Longinus, later turned into a saint, pokes Jesus in the side with his spear, which also becomes a holy relic called the Spear of Destiny, which Hitler was obsessed with, but that's for another time. Jesus doesn't respond, and they take him down because Joseph of Arimathea wants to bury him. This is also kind of questionable since bodies were often left as long as possible to make a point. But I digress. This is the recorded death of Jesus of Nazareth. So, to come back to what they did with bodies, they usually left the bodies to rot for months until they just fell off on their own, and then they would do whatever with the bones and just put the next person on the cross. It wasn't, this cross is specifically for you. They didn't make a cross for you. It was probably used by hundreds of people before you. Now, where does the topic of today's episode come in? While it said that Jesus was taken from the cross, he was wrapped in a shroud by his buddies Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and placed in a tomb close to Golgotha. 3 days later, he pops right up, alive and well, and casts off his shroud to ascend into heaven. So, what does this shroud look like? I have to thank Wikipedia because they have a great formal analysis of this that actually seems to be very accurate. So, it's 4.4 by 1.1 meters, and that means it's 14 feet 5 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. The length of cloth is made of flax herringbone twill, which herringbone is a kind of weave. There's an image of a man on it that would be between 5 feet 7 inches tall to 6'2", which is really tall in ancient times and in medieval times. Typically, people were around 5 foot to 5'7", and not many people were taller. There are a few exceptions. A lot of people who were tall were put as kings because they were thought of as a little bit more special. And I guess you could argue that Jesus is a king. So, I guess that's where that comes from. He's muscular and has shoulder-length hair and a beard and looks like a typical depiction of Jesus from around the medieval times. A lot of times Jesus is depicted as a tall white man with a brown beard and longer hair and the like. He's usually also very thin. His hands are conveniently over his groin, and there's a lot of discrepancy over what Jesus was wearing when he was crucified. I almost can guarantee you that he was naked. He's always depicted in like a little loincloth, but a lot of the time they did execute people naked, just for ease of getting around it. So the image has wounds. So the image's wounds consist of one wrist bearing a large round wound, apparently from piercing, an upward gouge in the side, an upward gouge to the right side, penetrating into the thoracic cavity, meaning his torso, small punctures around the forehead and scalp, scores of linear wounds on the torso and legs, swelling of the face, and streams of blood down both arms. Do these wounds sound familiar to you? Because they should. So, the one wrist or hand with the piercing, a lot of people would say that's the nail going through his hand or wrist. The upward gouge is when St. Longinus stabbed him with his spear to make sure that he was dead. The crown of thorns are the little punctures on his scalp and head. The wounds on his torso and legs are from whipping, swelling of the face. I don't really know how they can tell that. I don't really see that in the image, but I mean, that's what they say. So I guess that would be from asphyxiation, because you do tend to swell, and just swell in general after you die. And the streams of blood are just that. They're the wounds from his hands and from his body that he's received. So now that we've talked about the crucifixion and his wounds and the actual shroud, we can talk about the history of the shroud. So here's the dealio. In 1356, a French nobleman, Geoffroy I de Chauny, claimed he had the burial shroud of Jesus Christ in his possession. If you don't know what a relic is, it's a classification of objects that relate to people from the New Testament or people such as saints who came after, who are particularly holy and devout. There are 3 classes of relics, but the shroud would be classified under the lowest and the 3rd level. This is defined as something that touched or was in the presence of a holy person. There are actually a lot of 3rd level relics because that would be the most easy to make, and yeah, there were relics that were made. You can basically just put something in front of a relic or touch a relic to something, or touch something to a relic. Like, let's say you have a handkerchief and you touch the object holding a relic to it, and then your handkerchief is a relic. So it's kind of a little weird, but that's why I love this subject so much, because it's so bizarre. But a fun 3rd level relic is the chemise of the Virgin Mary, which is in France. And look at that, there's France again. And claims to be the shirt that Mary wore when she gave birth to Jesus. It's still hanging up, so go see it. To get back to the main story, the Bishop of Troyes, Henri de Poitiers, and his successor, Bishop Pierre d'Arcis, were the closest religious authority, and basically said, this is obviously a fake, and you paid a local artist to create it, so you could get even more rich and famous. So here we have these 2 men, first Henri, and then Pierre after Henri died, saying, this is a fake, you're exploiting the savior, the Christian savior, and you should be ashamed of yourself. So yeah, there's already doubt that this is real. And unfortunately, the Catholic peasants, so everyone besides the clergy and the aristocracy, love it and disregard the evidence and totally buy into the shroud as being real. And it wasn't so much that it was a fake. They knew it was a fake. They just chose, or they knew that there was something about it that was wrong, or that there was a rumor going around that it was fake, but they just chose to believe it was real. I actually have a theory that the reason why they chose to believe it was real was because the plague was still going around, and the plague happened in 1348 or 47, and it caused such a huge, horrible mass. I mean, half of the population of Europe died from the plague, so it's very possible that they chose to believe that it was real because they just wanted hope in something, because they kept seeing people that they loved die. So that's a long tangent, and I could go more into it, but that's my theory personally. So apparently the Bishop Pierre, the successor, was so upset that his evidence was being ignored that he went to the King of France, Charles, and asked him to intervene and basically stop Charny from toting around this piece and saying that it was real. The king immediately demanded that the forgery be seized, but Charny dodged every attempt. Pierre then went to the Pope, who told Charny, you can display it as long as you label it as a painting, not the actual shroud of Jesus. It is still not presented as the real shroud, but personally, I take it as we aren't going to tell you it's not the real shroud. So they're not saying it's real, but they're not saying it's fake either. So it's kind of keeping up the mystery. It was shown for years in the town of Léry, where it was supposedly found. And after a few decades, was in private hands until it found its home in Turin's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Italy, where it can still be seen. A little tidbit of information about the shroud is that really started being talked about after May 28th, 1898. When Seconda Pia was taking photographs of the shroud for courting purposes, it doesn't say why he was taking photos. I'm sure someone knows, but I don't. And noticed the remarkable image in the negative. So if you look at the Shroud of Turin, you're going to see a faint dark outline or a faint image. It is filled, but you can see a faint image of a man's face or body and everything else. But when you see the negative of it, it really comes out and you can very clearly see kind of a three-dimensionality about it, that it does look like a man. And for a long time, people said that he doctored the photographs, but this was proven false when the pictures were retaken in the 1930s. After that, interest in the shroud reignited, and it turned into this mystery that has blown way out of proportion, in my opinion. So, what is this thing? I think it's a fake. I really don't see any way around saying that it's a complete forgery. It would be really irresponsible of me to not pay attention to the glaring evidence that this was made in the mid-1300s by an artist in Léry, France, who Charny commissioned. It has been carbon dated several times, all of which say 1250 to 1390, so perfectly within the time of Charny to have had it made. The thing that bothers me about that fact is that a lot of people argue that they only dated the edges. They didn't take something from the center, which, I mean, you're not going to take the most blatant part of a painting to date. You're going to take something that's on the side so that people won't really see it. And a lot of believers in the shroud will argue, well, that's just the edges. Someone could have totally just added on to it and made it look fuller. But I think that's really stupid because it's totally a full, it looks correct. It doesn't look like it was added on to. Although that there is burning on some of the edges and some of the corners of folds are missing because it was in a fire. I don't know when the fire was or where it was when the fire happened, but there is scorching. So Bishop Pierre even relayed in his paper on the shroud, the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who painted it. Meaning he actually found the guy and he was like, oh yeah, that was me, I totally made that. Or he tortured him into confessing that he made it, which I really wouldn't put it past him. Or any priest or bishop from that time period. Okay, here's where I get upset also. I'm totally okay with people venerating this object and not worshiping it, because in Catholicism or in Christianity, you don't worship an object as the embodiment of your God. You use it as an aid to worship. So as long as they know the story behind it, and once they have the information, I really don't care what they do with it. But I know so many people who think that this is real, and I've watched a ton of documentaries, and I'm saying documentaries very lightly, on the Shroud of Turin, and all of them claim that the creation of the shroud is impossible to explain by any scientific process. I've seen them claim that only an all-encompassing light could have created it, or a spontaneous energy release, which is totally a scientific term relating to death. There was a rumor that it was Leonardo da Vinci who painted it, despite him being born almost 100 years after its creation. Someone else said that it was created by secretions of the body after death, but, I mean, whose body was it? Was it a person from the 1300s? Was it Jesus Christ? Who are you saying that it was? And to me, the most ridiculous one was that it was basically an early photograph, which I hear and it sounds absolutely ridiculous. And I actually watched a documentary where this guy tried to recreate it with doing it through like lemon juice and light, and yeah, it worked. But I don't think that any 1300s man or woman would have thought, I can put lemon juice on a piece of cloth, bleach it, and color it so that it looks like Jesus and fool millions of people. I really think that it was just a painting on a piece of cloth. I don't know what the materials are. I don't know what they use to paint. I'm in classes right now where we talk specifically about dyes and pigments from this era. I don't know what they used. They probably used a dye of some sort and heavily diluted it, but I really don't know the material. I would have to do a full year of research to find out what it is. And yeah, the photography thing worked, but I still don't think that a 1300s person would have thought that this could work, or even thought that might exist, or would have been a viable way of making an image. I think they literally would have gone for the easiest thing and painted or used dye. So I think it's safe to say that Bishop Henri and Bishop Pierre got it right, and that the shroud is a fake. While it can stand in for the idea of the Shroud of Jesus, it shouldn't be thought of as the real shroud. My question for the listeners is, what do you think should be done, or do you think anything should be done to discuss the authenticity of the shroud? Do you think it should be displayed as a fake, displayed as what the shroud could have looked like, displayed as a really exciting forgery, or I would love to hear your opinions about it. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Spooky Betches. I'm Kirsten, and remember to treat each other the way you want to be treated.